to re-embark. One of them will come back to die in the Rochelle. And it's in these papers and archives that tell the life of Misson that I received all of these documents. So writes Captain Johnson, the apparent author of these pirates. So he claimed that he gained knowledge about Libertalia through archives that were sent to him through the notably with details of the Labuse treasure. Now, the story of Libertalia would probably have remained top secret if in the 1930s a literature professor hadn't dusted it off by actually linking up the story of Libertalia with Daniel Defoe, the author, on the basis of stylistic and biographical considerations, argues that the author of the general history of pirates is the author of Robinson Crusoe. Now, it's true that there's a lot of archival evidence. The author is probably a sailor, someone who knew about piracy from the press, had a whole series of witness tales to focus on in writing the tale. But in terms of Defoe's filiation, it would mean that the whole piracy story is a fiction. So that really is the starting point for the reality behind the fiction, the reliability of a source, the authenticity of an archive in terms of literary production in England in the 18th century. And Arne Bialuszewski was one of the protagonists in the controversy surrounding attribution of this text. He published an article in 2004 who put forward the argument that it was not Daniel Defoe who wrote the book, but rather Nathaniel Mist, a Jacobite printer, and he has serious reasons for thinking that he is the actual author of this book. So Arnaud Bialuszewski will be taking the floor later on. He's at the University of Kiel in Germany, and he started working on his pirate studies there. He's currently at Trent University in Ontario, and he works on the tie-in between piracy and the slave trade in Madagascar, but it also looks at the relationship between pirates, buccaneers, filibusters, and indigenous peoples in the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean. Next stage, then, which is also one of the reasons why we're organizing this afternoon's work. Last year, 1 year ago, Graeber's last book was published, Les Pirates des Lumières, Pirates of the Enlightenment, and this was presented at the Salon Jacques Chirac. The protagonist here is also here today. It was Maurizio Esposito La Rosa, who's a doctoral student, actually postdoctoral now at the Musée du quai Branly, and he completed his thesis in anthropology, gold and money, dynasties and hierarchies in the Sakalava kingdoms in Madagascar. Now, Maurizio is going to tell us a little bit more about his reading of Graeber. And on the 10th of March 2020,
Nicolas Norito,
the editor of the Libertalia publishing house, had published the book by David Graeber. And at some point we were even hoping that David Graeber himself might be able to be there. And unfortunately, that was not to be the case. And we heard about the very sad passing of David Graeber after that. So this day today, actually, after the colloquium organized at the EHESS yesterday, is also a way for us to pay tribute to David Graeber. And so in this sense, we've moved away from trying to demonstrate the existence of Libertalia, is it fact or fiction, and it's moved now towards a more social science discussion with an anthropological lens on the subject. So Maurizio Esposito La Rosa will talk to us about the book by Graeber. And Alexandre Audard, who is a young historian who's also currently still doing his thesis under the supervision of Didier Nativelle, Paris 7. It's a thesis that looks at the Indian Ocean and national constructions in a naval colonial-based Diego Suarez, Madagascar, 1885 to 1973. Now, Alexandre Audard's thesis doesn't actually focus on Libertalia per se, but his master's did. And so before signing up for his PhD, he published his thesis dissertation, and that's the book that you have on the slide. So this is really the topical aspect of the work, which is based on these two books that have been published within a year on Libertalia. And we'll be able to discuss this in more detail, the idea of the genealogy of writing through Libertalia. We have Hubert Deschamps, who is relevant to both historians and anthropologists of Madagascar. And I just wanted to close this introduction to ask the question, should we set aside the historical reality or not of Libertalia, which some were still bent upon finding very recently? And you can see on the screen a couple of books which make up the pirate library, if you like. Gilles Lapouge's work in 1968, which places the libertarian pirate at the center stage, the rebel pirate. He's the one who really disseminated that idea, and it's Marcus Rediker's work is a kind of academic translation of those ideas. And then there's the Daniel Defoe translation by Michel Lebris and the introduction of the second volume, where an announcement is made of not just an imminent discovery of Libertalia, but the actual identity of Capitaine Misson. Suddenly, the truth would out with the revelation of the actual identity of Capitaine Misson. So, how can we track down Libertalia? Some people even wanted to turn to archaeological digs up to the pseudo-pirate cemeteries, which Alexandre will mention. Now, for anthropologists, the truth lies elsewhere, in the memory, in the legacy of the populations that bore the brunt of colonial violence in the Caribbean and in the Indian Ocean. So this is perhaps one of the areas of agreement or divergence, but in terms of giving an appraisal of the pirate phenomenon in the modern era, looking at trade, the slave trade, these are the kinds of things that we will focus on to be able to comment and detail our discussion around Libertalia. Sorry for taking the floor for quite a long time. I'm going to leave the floor now to the first speakers, so they're pre-videoed recordings, and we will begin. I'm just going to, there you go, that's the program. So just to give you an idea, we're going to listen to Maurizio Esposito La Rosa first of all, then Alexandre Audard, and then Arnaud Bialuszewski, following which, when we've heard those three presentations, we'll have a first open discussion. You can ask your questions on the chat, and I can see that some of you have already started writing things up on the chat. So we'll be back live at 3:15 p.m. French time, and then there'll be a second session where we'll hear Marcus Rediker's conclusions and an open discussion again, bringing to bear the various different presenters and your questions and, that you want to ask. Thank you very much. I hope you have an excellent afternoon under this pirate flag today.
Merci Vincent et merci à toutes et à tous d'être là.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and thanks to all of you for being there. The Monsters and Ghosts of 18th century novels are a reaction to the rationalism of Enlightenment, and similarly, according to Graeber, pirates are fictional and historical characters who inspired the political utopia of the philosophers of Enlightenment. Their political experiences, according to him, form the basis of modern democratic ideology. Pirates lived at the margin of the emerging world trade order and refused to take part in the rigid, hierarchical mode of organization of slave trading ships. Instead, they practiced an egalitarian form of organization, which probably inspired the democratic ideals of European Enlightenment. The myth of the pirate republic known as Libertalia, founded in Madagascar by a French retired pirate and a defrocked Italian priest, is an example of the influence exerted by pirates on the political imagination of the era. Now, whether Libertalia truly existed or whether it's an invention of Captain Johnson, aka Daniel Defoe, is irrelevant for Graeber. What matters is that his book, The Pirates of Enlightenment, what his book tries to demonstrate is that there have been practical historical experiences behind the construction of the myth. The book was published for the first time in French in 2019 by the French publishing house Libertalia and attempts to reveal the historical origins behind the myth. In spite of the objective contained in the subheading of the book, which is to reconstruct the real story of Libertalia, Graeber's story doesn't describe a historical reality, but instead interprets past history in order to have an impact on the present. So instead of a faithful account of past political organizations, his history of pirates in Madagascar is a retrospective theory on the existence of other forms of political organization. This is done in the same spirit as other work by Graeber on the history of social inequality and forms of political organization, such as his book about debt or his recent book with archaeologist David Graeber. As stated in his theoretical book, Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, for Graeber, anthropology is the discipline that is best suited to examine alternative social, political, and economical experiences around the world and make them known. And it is for this reason that Graeber's book on Libertalia is first and foremost an attempt to provide yet another example of alternative political organizations that may have existed throughout human history. In this sense, Graeber's anthropology is itself utopian or prophetic. It is a prophecy that projects itself into the future as well as into the past. One could say, to quote Foucault, that the truth of his book lays in the future. Indeed, certain historical or anthropological elements contradict the historical reconstruction of his book. However, Graeber's Pirate of Enlightenment attempts to have a real impact on the present and on the future. This forms the basis of anarchist anthropology according to Graeber, as illustrated in his statement in Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology. I quote, "Marxism has tended to be a theoretical or analytical discourse on revolutionary strategy, whereas anarchism has tended to be an ethical discourse on revolutionary practice." Graeber's book on Libertalia is but one item within this political and theoretical project. Now, more specifically, it is one of the later stages in his project to decolonize Enlightenment, as he says himself in his introduction. He started this project in 2007 with the essay There Never Was a West, which was translated and published in French under the title Democracy at the Margins, La Démocratie en Marge. And then he carried on this project with his collaboration with David Graeber on the universal history of social inequalities. There is a fragment of this work titled How to Change the Course of History and another fragment titled The Wisdom of Conjurung, published in 2019 in the journal Mouse, which you can find online. Now, this project does not aim so much to criticize the major figures of enlightenment as promoters of false democratic ideals used by the leaders of the time to justify colonial abuse, but instead it attempts to shed light on those that history has forgotten, in this instance, indigenous people, women, and among so-called white populations, pirates. Now, for Graeber, there is a direct relationship between this positive way of constructing an alternative history and the anarchist practice of direct action. This activism stands in opposition to the criticism, to negative criticism and negative debate. The criticism of left-wing intellectuals towards the white protagonists of history, as well as street protests against political figures, always tend to praise the same well-known historical figures and to neglect the more marginal characters. Graeber's objective, whether as an activist or as an intellectual, consists in showing positive alternatives, whilst reinstating the lower classes forgotten by history and marginalized by power. Based on the examples of rural communities in Madagascar or medieval Iceland, as well as pirate ships and trading communities in the Indian Ocean, or Iroquois federal institutions which may have influenced the American Constitution, the American anthropologist undertakes a criticism of the official history of democracy. This criticism rests on two assumptions. The first assumption is that democracy should not be considered as specific to the West. Indeed, the history of Western political institutions shows that Western tradition is just as hostile as the Indian, Chinese, or Mesoamerican tradition to anything that may be considered a democracy. They are authoritarian traditions just as much as the Western tradition. The second assumption, which is connected with the first, is that democratic practices have generally emerged in the intermediate spaces which elude state control. Now, before going into further detail on Graeber's theory on Libertalia, I'd like to talk about a few biographical aspects of this anthropologist who died all too soon, and who is the object of today's study day, and also yesterday's study day at EHESS. David Graeber was born in a New York working-class, politically active family, and he was involved in activism from a very early age. He became a member of the International Workers of the World Union. He completed his PhD at the University of Chicago under the supervision of another activist anthropologist, Marshall Salins, who also recently passed away. The book Lost People was derived from his thesis on the rural communities of Madagascar. In this book, he analyzes the strategies used by slave descendants to seize the lands of aristocrats who had moved to the city. In 1998, Graeber taught at Yale University, where his contract was not renewed due to his political views. In 2014, following the movement Occupy Wall Street, in which he played a leading role, he left his New York apartment and moved to London, where he taught until his untimely death in September 2020. There are many anecdotes about the elusive Graeber, always traveling and supporting social movements scattered around the world, such as the Rojava revolutionary movement in Syria, for example. He's well known for his political books on a variety of social and economic issues, such as debt, currency, bureaucracy, and bullshit jobs. In 2017, he wrote a book about sovereignty, with his former supervisor, Marshall Salins, titled Kings. Originally, Kings was a book about pirates and was supposed to be the last chapter in this book. It was supposed to be about the false kings of Madagascar. And so the book about Libertalia originated in this book. The main theory in this book is that even if the pirate Republic of Libertalia never existed, a similar political experience did take place on the eastern coast of Madagascar, on the initiative of Madagascan populations influenced by the pirates. This is the Betsimisaraka political confederation. This confederation is the basis for the myth of Libertalia, according to Graeber. Instead of an egalitarian colony of Western pirates, the real Libertalia is the product of the pirate culture developed aboard the ships and then redeployed by the Madagascans on the east coast, an experience in which women played a leading role. Contrary to Western historiographic paradigm, which tends to separate the history of Europeans from that of indigenous people, this experience is the fruit of an alliance between Europeans and Madagascans living at the margins of world trade. According to Graeber's reconstruction and inspired by the theories of Marcus Rediker, pirates stood against the rationale of international trade and developed a form of democratic management of their ships and their plunder. Those former pirates of the Caribbean were attracted by the abundance of goods in circulation in the Indian Ocean and settled on the east coast of Madagascar from the end of the 17th century. In doing so, they transposed to the villages that they founded the same egalitarian proto-democratic model. Thanks to the alliance with Madagascan women, thanks to that alliance, pirates integrated with the local population and refused to take part in the slave trade, contrary to other Europeans in the Indian Ocean. As for Madagascan women, they benefited from the presence of these foreigners and rebelled against the patriarchal order established in Madagascar by the dominant Muslim groups, who were established there since the 14th century. In reaction to this emerging power of women, the Madagascan lineage chiefs founded the Betsimisaraka Confederation under the leadership of a mixed race son of an English pirate and Madagascan princess. This confederation was organized in an egalitarian way according to the teachings of the pirates. This Betsimisaraka Confederation is the historic source of the myth of Libertalia. This myth then circulated in Europe from the publication of the General History of the Most Notorious Pirates by Captain Johnson in 1724, and together with other legends, it influenced the libertarian imagination of the philosophers of Enlightenment. Now, Graeber's theory contains a number of contradictions and a number of documentary problems, but it is also an important progress in the critique of the Western historiographic paradigm. Let's start with the limitations of Graeber's theory. Firstly, the theory according to which democratic modes of organization were in place on pirate ships remain to be proven. More generally, historical source on which Graeber bases his work are thin on the ground. Most of the logical articulation of his reconstruction is mere speculation. It is very suggestive, that is true, but robust it is not. There is another question about the Betsimisaraka Confederation and the absence of hierarchy within it. As ethnographic studies of Madagascar shows, Madagascan collectives are organized hierarchically according to seniority. And this is the case in several regions in the island. In Madagascan lineage system and Betsimisaraka lineage system, the eldest in the group is the one who has the most authority. While it is true that people's assemblies mentioned by Graeber are important aspects of decision-making, speaking order and the authority to make judgment is extremely hierarchical. The absence of centralization of power, which Graeber attributes to the Betsimisaraka of Madagascar, does not necessarily imply that this political confederation is egalitarian and that it is devoid of any social hierarchy. This theory, in my opinion, is based on an ethnocentric vision of social hierarchy as connected to the centralization of power, and it is based on a state-led model. And finally, what is perhaps the most problematic contradiction in Graeber's attempt to decolonize Western and Madagascan history is that in this experience, it is Western pirates who play a central role, in spite of the active role which Graeber grants to the Madagascan protagonists. The Madagascans may have founded this proto-democratic confederation, yet they have been influenced, according to Graeber, by European pirates. There is certainly a contrast with dominant powers and a dialectic with indigenous populations, yet it is always Westerners who play the role of a civilizing force. Yet, in spite of these limitations, the merit of Graeber's historic reconstruction is to come up with another way of writing history, which goes beyond the epic or hagiographic model based on great personalities as the leading force of history. For Graeber, even the history of pirates of legend and well-known captains is a story that really belongs to the anonymous sailors who all contributed equally to the experimentation with radical forms of political organization. It is the anonymous multitudes, whether pirates, Madagascan women, mixed-race children of lineage chiefs, of marginal communities, who enabled the great historical progress and generated the underlying myths of modern democracies. In this perspective, Graeber comes up with a vision of history as a collective movement which echoes Gramsci's philosophy of history, and which is beautifully summed up in a poem by Bertolt Brecht. This poem is titled A Worker Reads History. It is an epigraph to a book which is another example of this type of popular historiography. This book is A People's History of the World by Chris Harman, and I'd like to read you a few lines by Brecht by way of conclusion.
Chi ha construit Thèbes aux sept portes?
Who built Thebes of the Seven Gates? In the books, you will find the name of kings. Did the kings haul up the lumps of rock? And Babylon, many times demolished. Who raised it up so many times? In what houses of gold, glittering lima, did the builders live? Where, the evening that the wall of China was finished, did the masons go? Great Rome is full of triumphal arches. Who erected them? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Had Byzantium, much praised in song, only palaces for its inhabitants? Even in fabled Atlantis, the night the ocean engulfed it, the drowning still bawled for their slaves. Young Alexander conquered India. He alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Was there not even a cook in his army? Philip of Spain wept as his fleet was sunk and destroyed. Were there no other tears? Frederick the Great triumphed in the 7 Years' War. Who triumphed with him? Each page a victory. At whose expense the victory ball? Every 10 years a great man. But who paid the piper? So many particulars, so many questions. And finally, I'd like to add a couplet to this poem, which I think sums up very well what Graeber has to say in Libertalia. The intellectuals of Enlightenment discussed democracy in the salons around Europe, but who in the rest of the world fought to implement democracy? I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je suis très heureux d'être parmi vous et avant toute chose, je tiens à remercier Vincent Guigueno et les organisateurs de cette demi-journée d'études de m'avoir convié à présenter mon ouvrage Libertalia, une république des pirates à Madagascar, interprétation d'un mythe 17e, 21e siècle, qui est donc paru en décembre dernier aux éditions Maisonneuve et la Rose, Hémisphère. Ce livre sur Libertalia s'inscrit dans la continuité de mon mémoire de master de recherche, soutenu en 2018 à l'Université de Paris sous la direction de Didier Nativelle, qui est par ailleurs préfacier du livre, et qui s'intitulait « Le mythe de Libertalia entre utopie pirate et réalité historique ». J'ai découvert l'histoire de Libertalia, non pas dans les livres, mais à Madagascar lorsque j'y habitais, au début des années 2010, et j'avais été frappé par la mise en scène de l'histoire des pirates de Madagascar et par sa centralité
in Madagascar and by its centrality in the local tourist economy. On Sainte-Marie, for example, the island where I lived later and where pirate colonies cropped up in the 18th century, you can visit a pirate cemetery, which isn't one at all, because it contains the tombstones of 19th century colonial administrators. This is true for the tombstone that you can see here, which seems to be a pirate grave because of its designs, the skull and bones, but it's not at all. You can then saunter down to the William Kidd restaurant, the pirate or the galleon, before quaffing a Libertalia beer, which is no longer produced, on the terrace of the Libertalia Hotel. In 2015, the pirate past of the island was even given national media coverage when there was an apparent discovery of silver bullion, which was actually lead ballast, in a Sainte-Marie shipwreck that was put forward as being William Kidd's. Dotted along the coastline, for example, in Antsiranana, which is where I'm currently doing field work right at the north of Madagascar. This was called Diego Suarez during the colonial era. And you may have heard of Diego Suarez because that's where many people see it as where Libertalia happened. And in that context, pirate figures and representations abound for the tourists, and that's where the photo for today's event was taken. And so it's later on, when I read the chapters in the second volume on the general history of pirates, focusing on Libertalia, as we were told earlier, that I decided to focus on this in my research. As you know, there is still ongoing debate around the author's identity. Daniel Defoe, is it Nathaniel Mist? Despite the fact that pirates did spend time in Madagascar between 1680 and 1730, despite the fact that the author, the famous Charles Johnson, wrote at the time, we've known for a long time, because of specialists of utopia, travel literature, and Daniel Defoe, of course, that the chronology of events is pure invention. And that ultimately, Libertalia is nothing but a literary construction that's not existed as it's put forward in the book. And contrary to what is often stated, it only gained wider readership towards the end of the 19th century, before which nobody was interested in it at all. Why then, despite the lack of archival and archaeological evidence, has Libertalia continued to fascinate from that point on, from the end of the 19th century? And why is it at the heart today of a topical academic discussion and publications, despite latent skepticism? Now, in this context, I thought it was important to try to rephrase a seemingly simple question in my book. Did Libertalia really exist? And just to cover everything, if not, could it have existed? And surprising as it may sound, historians have never really examined this possibility because, on the one hand, as a work seen as being written by Defoe, it is seen as fiction, but also, on the other hand, because pirate studies still suffer today from tropes around pirates and piracy. And so here I'd beg to differ with David Graeber. For Graeber, as we were told earlier, the issue of whether Libertalia existed or not is futile. He states that Libertalia is a European transcription and a reappropriation of a conscious political experiment undertaken by Malagasy speakers. And so in this sense, Libertalia would be but an allegory, and it would be futile to try to seek its remains. By doing this, David Graeber sweeps away a whole spate of research, which he criticizes in his introduction, quite unfairly to my mind. And for me, this is quite problematic, because firstly, Libertalia could just refer to multiple phenomena and be open to any and every conceivable interpretation. But also, because it sets aside the narrative strung together by the author. Daniel Defoe, alias Captain Charles Johnson, chooses how to portray events. In other words, how Misson and Caraccioli meet in Rome, the abduction of women in the Indian Ocean, wars in the Comores. He specifically names characters like Misson, Caraccioli, and Thieu, of course, and he lends them ideals. And of course, remember that at the time, talk of republic is not a light matter at the 18th century, and nor would one do it without reason. So rather than do away or move away from these doubts around and ambiguities around the text, I decided to tackle it head on and try to understand why the text was written by Defoe in 1728 and what it could mean to contemporary readers. And in this, I follow in the steps of other researchers, for example, Jean-Michel Racot, but two Malagasy speakers who are specialists of travel literature, Anne-Mollet Sauvager and Nivoeliso Galibert, sadly no longer with us today. And they produced remarkable work on the topic. They're often rendered invisible, unfortunately. So rather than just pointing to the fact that it's fiction, if I may say, as they did, and as others before them did as well, as a historian working on Madagascar, I wanted to try to give clues to understanding and contextualizing the tale. In other words, to try to examine the historical foundations for the tale, to try to see what pushed Defoe to write such a story, before looking back to the means of the myth production under a longer view angle. So I really think it's essential to reread Libertalia through what the historical archives can tell us, notably by looking at the history of developing ties between coastal and Malagasy groups and European pirate spheres between the years 1680 and 1730. In contrast to what Graeber points out, there are many and varied period documents and records. In fact, it's important to underline, for those who might question official archival perspectives on marginal figures, many of the archives are written by pirates themselves. For example, there's a deed of sale for a ship that's signed by one pirate, a letter sent to the governor of Bourbon, the current Ile de la Réunion, and there's even a letter sent by a pirate's wife living in the American colonies. And so for a whole spate of reasons linked to the beginnings of the plantation economy in the Caribbean, linked to European wars, European pirates use use Madagascar as a port of call and to replenish supplies. And by doing so, they constitute the Indian Ocean as a locus of piracy. But what they want to do with their illegal plunder is go back and make the most of it at home. A few of them settled there. The governor of New York used to deride this. He's wrote to criticize these pirate settlements. And usually in terms of Libertalia, there's a classic parcours of mutineers attracted by the gleam of Indian wealth and some settling there, trying to plunder gold from Arabia and other precious jewels. Now, even though the archives point to very different pirate trajectories, none actually seems similar to that of Libertalia. In contrast to Misson and his crew, pirates are the main intermediaries in the slave trade. They're in contact with European merchants, and they themselves often own many slaves. Perhaps Raphael Thibault will tell us about this later on. Now, when the famous pirate Labuse asks the governor of Bourbon in 1724 for amnesty, he also asks that he may keep his slaves because they are his main bounty and they are what justifies and give legitimacy to his social status as a captain. And there are many would try to emulate him. Now, what David Graeber argues is that pirates defended the Malagasy against the slave trade. This is erroneous, and the interaction was actually highly violent. The Libertalia tale goes against the types of economic and political power play at the time and the slave trade. And this is the Europeans were always submitted to the rule of the Malagazis. They had to fire cannons when they came into the bay. They had to bring gifts to the royal figures. There were a whole series of rules that they had to follow. And of course, the Malagasy lands were not virgin territory, as the tale seems to point. They're very local, dynamic, vibrant economic hubs that are instated in longer commercial trade routes, and this for many centuries. There are the Antalauch communities, Islamic communities, seafarers that have a lot of experience. And furthermore, the 17th century is a century for transformation in Madagascar. There are new kingdoms that appear, that set up in the west, for example, the Sakalava kingdom, and the wealth of the Sakalava kingdom comes from control of the ports, notably. Introduction of firearms brings to bear a whole new political geography, but it should not be overestimated. And the rulers tolerated and sometimes favoured the establishment of pirates because they drew military benefit from it. For example, with the beachcombers in Polynesia, that happened a bit later. So we're very far from this image of drunken kinglets that's built by the colonial historiography. Libertalia looks at all of this for the Comores, but Misson and his companions arrive in an uninhabited bay in Madagascar and establish absolutely no relations with local societies. The Malagazis are not even secondary actors, they're completely impossible, which is totally unfeasible. And aside from this, pirates are exclusively men. You've got Mary Read, you've got Anne Boney, but these really are just exceptions to the rule, and they tell us nothing about pirate crews at the time. Once the pirate had set foot on land, where they have no local ties, for example Madagascar, well, it's through marriage that they'll be able to integrate and settle down. And this is mentioned in the archival sources. These marriages become more and more institutionalized. This is the Vadim Bazaha, which is talked about in the book. And it gives structure to the society in the context of mutual interests. These alliances allow the pirates to gain access to land ownership, and they enable women to become more powerful in their role as intermediaries to master languages and control trade. The governor of Bourbon wrote ironically that pirates were by necessity and by fear the slaves of these women. Of course, the personal motivations of each and every one will not be known, but you can find a similar type of practices in Southeast Asia or in Senegal with the Signor women from the city of St. Louis. Now, in the tale, the pirates don't marry a single Malagasy woman, don't take part in any local society events. So their story is, they legitimate the story of their abduction of 100 Moorish girls because they needed women. And again, this seems completely unfeasible. So Madagascar, as it's presented in the story, doesn't correspond to what we know of the reality of its inhabitants, nor of the seafarers that landed there. Beyond the historical inconsistencies, which clearly show that the author never went to Madagascar, the text is seen as a superimposition of the different European representations of the islands and of the inhabitants of the time. As always, the island is presented as some kind of Eden, a beautiful, luxurious tropics inhabited by Malagazis in a sort of golden age. And you can see it on this painting. The heart is right, the island is at the heart of colonial aspirations in the 17th century. This man is pointing to Madagascar on the globe. So, Misson and the Liberi were mysteriously massacred at the end of the book. Mysteriously is a term drawn from the book. This is once again a way of the author coming up with the trope of the treacherous and perfidious Malagasy fighting against colonial settlers, because it has to be recalled that there was no colonization on the island. So the presence of the pirates on the island really fed into all types of representations and tropes of, rich pirates. That was, of course, not the case. And this is also a way to make mockery of myths of the time. Misson is a variation, if you like, on the character Avery, who was responsible for raiding the official convoy of the Grand Mogul on the way to the Mecca. This is actually the biggest loot ever garnered in the history of piracy, more than 50 million current pounds. And apparently he captured women as well and became king of Madagascar. You can see it in the re-edition, the republication of this volume here. Now, this created a huge scandal. If Misson had existed, we would have known about his actions. And this part of the story points specifically to that. And the rest of the story is drawn from testimonies, written and oral, from the time. And I show in my book how these are drawn from travelers' tales, again contemporary with the time. So this story of an egalitarian democratic republic really should be set within the wider literary context of Protestant utopias. Let's recall that Defoe was pilloried for his religious ideas. It's also about the political use or utilization of the pirate figure that I've developed in the book. And focusing on notably François Leguat's real tale, who wanted to go to Bourbon to Réunion. You have the main characters then, François Maximilien Mission, Thomas Tew, and the Italian Calvinist Galeazzo Caracciolo. So for a reader of the time, if indeed there were many readers at the time, the tale is a call to colonize Madagascar, called by the British nation, and a critique of the political and religious institutions of its time, hence the prophetic discourse of Caraccioli in the book. So Libertalia is far from being a real seafarer's tale, but it's a very savant blend of different images and representations. In contrast to stating that Libertalia would be the transcription of a Malagasy experience, I postulate something else, which is that Libertalia is a fully fledged European representation of Madagascar and its inhabitants. It reflects the way that Europeans fantasized and perceived Madagascar during the early colonial empires. Now, the text was not republished, was not disseminated in the 18th century, but the text sparked a new interest at the end of the 19th century through French colonizers to Madagascar that quickly tried to seek all the archives and documents on the island to be able to better understand it, and of course with a view to better dominating their populations. Now, even though they considered the history of the Republic as unbelievable, intellectuals involved in the colonial endeavor will see in Libertalia a useful tale which will put forward the ancient nature of the ties between France and Madagascar. For us, this history is a way of looking at the French founder of a republic 3 centuries before to legitimate colonial empires. And it's also more true because the pirates are perceived as the pioneers of colonization. You can see this military officer dressed as a sort of Malagasy Robinson. And it's a kind of unofficial history of colonization. Now, this French colonial library was built up, or publications were built up by lovers of Madagascar like Alfred and Guillaume Grandidier, Hubert Deschamps, and Libertalia has been linked in French thinking to a historical fact. Given the importance of these university researchers, nobody dared to contradict them, and so people still refer to Deschamps' book on pirates of Madagascar without being aware that the same author used to write under a pseudonym about stories where he founded a pirate republic in Africa. Since then, this French myth, which has been reset in its historical context, is constantly instrumentalized to serve more contemporary ideas. Libertalia then became a critique of contemporary capitalism. It becomes an explanation for the multiculturalism of the southwest islands of the Indian Ocean, or it becomes a romantic literary trope, bringing together all sorts of exotic stereotypes. So, to conclude, Libertalia is an abiding colonial myth, and it's an imagined representation of Madagascar. Madagascar is seen as a new paradise, a new Eden because of its nature, or a land of adventure for the tourists. But every time we do that, the Malagazys are set aside from the history because they're never mentioned in the story. So this we have to question. And however fascinating the story of pirates in Madagascar, it has nothing to do with the Republic of Libertalia. As the great historian Françoise Raison-Jourde wrote, and her quote is up there on the screen, and it's in my book as well, writing on Madagascar is not a straightforward thing. The enduring nature of European fantasies on the islands has to be re-questioned, and to come back with today's theme, we have to do away with Libertalia, not as a historical object, but as a prism through which the history of Madagascar and its inhabitants can be read. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer your questions and go a bit further on some of the parts of my book. Thanks.
My name is Arne Gilszewski, and I teach history at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. The title of my paper is To the Edge of the Known World, How Madagascar Became a Pirate Island. Madagascar is actually a spelling that was common in the English colonies in the 1680s. In my paper, I will show that piracy in the late 17th century was closely intertwined with the slave trade, and piracy in the Indian Ocean only flourished because in Madagascar, pirates could count on support from the slave trade. The center of pirate activity in the 17th century was the Caribbean, where French, Dutch, and English raiders seized Spanish targets and provided their respective nations with crucial support to establish colonial empires. In the 1670s, however, raiders in the Caribbean faced increasing challenges. Their spoils became smaller, and the peace treaty of 1670 restricted raids on Spanish targets, at least for the raiders that were based in Jamaica. At this point, many Caribbean freebooters sought other sources of income. Some became engaged in slaving raids, and others joined the African slave trade. Some freebooters crossed the Isthmus of Panama and sought new targets in the Pacific Ocean. In 1685 and 1686, 2 vessels sailed from the west coast of America to the Indian Ocean, where they touched Madagascar, and from there they made their way back to Europe. In 1683, a number of Caribbean pirate gangs crossed the Atlantic and assaulted vessels of West Africa. These men targeted gold shipments, but most of the vessels that they seized in 1683 and 1684 carried slaves. In some cases, pirates tried to extort ransom for slaves, but they mostly failed, and the pirate vessels soon returned to the Americas. At the same time, traders from the American colonies increasingly sailed to Madagascar. They did so to circumvent the monopoly of the Royal African Company on the west coast of Africa. This was evidently a profitable business, and from about 1677, trading voyages to Madagascar became regular occurrences. There can be no doubt that part of the crews were sailors that had previously served on raiding vessels. In 1686, there was a second wave of Caribbean raiders that crossed the Atlantic and appeared on the west coast of Africa. This time, however, a few vessels sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and reached Madagascar. Actually, it is possible to follow the tracks of one crew that made the way to Madagascar after a series of failures in the Caribbean. In August 1684, Thomas Handley participated in a large-scale assault on St. Augustine in Spanish Florida, but the raid turned out to be a failure. In January 1685, his crew seized vessels off the Venezuelan coast, and then they sailed to Jamaica. In June 1685, Handley arrived in Bermuda and left with 2 other vessels for the west coast of Africa. Then in February 1686, Handley's gang seized a Dutch slave vessel, the Westerwake, on the northwest coast of Madagascar. We do not know what happened in the next few months, but he returned in May 1687 with a Moorish prize, that's a quote, to the Bahamas. At that time, it was generally assumed that it was neither illegal nor a sin to rob from what these pirates regarded as heathens. In the following years, more pirate gangs made their long voyage to the Indian Ocean. Many stopped in St. Augustine in the southwest of Madagascar to take in water and provisions. In 1689, slave traders reported that no less than 3 pirate vessels, 2 were described as English, 1 as Dutch, had returned from the raid of the Persian Gulf. At the same time, more vessels from New York and Boston sailed to Madagascar to purchase slaves. And then in 1690, the New York merchant Frederick Phillips sent Adam Baldridge to Madagascar to establish a trading post in Sainte Marie, the northeast of Madagascar. Baldridge arrived in April 1691. He formed an alliance with the locals and he built a small fortified trading post. In the following years, Sainte Marie became a base of operations for pirates and slave traders. Baldridge bartered provisions and supplies for plunder. The establishment of this trading post provided the pirates with a safe harbor where they could pawl between cruises and thus prolong their stay in the Indian Ocean. Baldridge also served as an intercultural broker connecting different branches of the pirate trade. Every business opportunity was explored and exploited. However, it is important to realize that vessels coming from the Atlantic Ocean still sailed along the west coast of Madagascar and stopped there if necessary before they took course for the Comoro Islands or farther north, where they preyed upon Muslim shipping. Only on their way back did pirates call at Sainte Marie. One of Baldridge's first customers in October 1691 was George Rayner, who had seized an Indian prize from Surat with enormous treasures on board. The crew then careened their vessel and purchased cattle from Baldridge before they headed for South Carolina. In the following years, Baldridge continued to work in the slave trade. Trading vessels from New York provided him with provisions, naval stores, sails, ammunition, and liquors. While parts of the good were used to acquire slaves, many goods were actually sold to pirates, who then managed to refit their vessels for another raid, the northern part of the Indian Ocean. Baldridge also helped pirates purchase cattle and rice from the native communities. However, not all pirates were successful. Quite a few crews that called at Sainte Marie arrived empty-handed. Some pirates joined the crews of slave vessels, and others fitted out vessels for additional raids. Probably the main challenge that seafarers faced in the Indian Ocean was the decay of their vessels. On Sainte Marie, pirates could repair their vessels, They could acquire rigging and new sails, and they could assemble new crews. This continued until 1698, when pirates abused local women and the Malagasy overran the trading post, killing all Europeans they encountered. At the same time, the authorities in New York cut off all shipping ties to Madagascar. Of the last 4 trading vessels that arrived in Madagascar, 2 were seized by pirates who needed new vessels for further raids. 1 pirate crew joined the slave trade to make an extra profit after a rather unsuccessful trip or voyage to the Red Sea. The pirates who were active in the Indian Ocean soon began to suffer from a lack of supplies. Their vessels fell apart, and after 2 or 3 years in tropical waters, they could not use these vessels anymore. Around 1700, hundreds of pirates were stranded in Madagascar. Many of them died of tropical diseases, but there were also a substantial number of men who integrated into native communities, particularly on the island's east coast. This brings me to the conclusion. The pirates that were active in the Indian Ocean, far away from the markets of the colonial world, relied on the base of operations in Madagascar. The island served as a market where pirates obtained supplies that enabled them to seize, rob, and mistreat Muslim seafarers and their passengers for almost 10 years. The slave trade provided an infrastructure to support piracy during those years. Thank you very much.
Oui. Je peux y aller. Alors j'attends Maurizio. Il faudrait que
So I'm just waiting for Maurizio, and Alexander needs to reconnect as well.
On est sur la dernière image encore de Arme, je crois. Voilà. Ok. Tu nous rebascules, c'est ça? J'ai un son assez faible.
My sound is quite weak, unfortunately, says Vincent.
Bien, donc nous retrouvons en direct après ces 3 premières...
So we are live again after these initial 3 presentations. I think that Anna Bialuszewski will not be able to be with us straight away. He will be there during the general discussion, though.
Je vais peut-être demander d'abord aux protagonistes...
So first I'm going to ask the speakers the main speakers to react to the presentations, because there are wide differences in the interpretation of the history of Libertalia. Now I have a question for Alexandre Audard. When you published the book, how much did you take into account Graeber's book? Is it just a coincidence that these 2 books were published quite closely together, since one is a reply to the other?
Donc merci pour cette remarque. Non, il se trouve que
Thanks for this comment.
Comme je l'avais mentionné,
It's mere chance.
ce mémoire en 2018, et j'ai découvert, comme tout le monde, en librairie.
I presented my thesis in 2018, and then I found out about David Graeber's book at the same time as everyone else. It so happened that I was writing my book at the same time, and David Graeber's interpretation was similar to that of other books which I criticize in my book, and as well as other representations that attempted to reinterpret the myth of Libertalia and give it real historical legitimacy. So this was an opportunity for me to react in my book about certain comments by Graeber about the slave trade, for example, because as I mentioned earlier, Graeber supports the idea that pirates defended Madagascans against the slave trading ships. And as I mentioned, and as Anna Bieleczewski's communication mentioned, pirates were brokers of the slave trade. They put people in slavery rather than defending them against it.
La question de l'existence de Libertalia.
Now, about the existence of Libertalia, this really was an echo to all the other books you mentioned in the introduction by Gilles Lapouche and Michel Lebris and other Anglo-Saxon authors. These authors, throughout their studies on Libertalia, exclude this idea of the existence of Libertalia. People want to believe in it. A number of authors defend its historical reality. But there are archival, textual, no other proofs, even in Madagascar memory. There was no mention of it before David Graeber's book. Of course, things have changed now because his book has had a certain impact in Madagascar. Libertalia was a sort of thorn in the side of people who had an interest in piracy, in Pirates of Madagascar. So this is why, in my book, I try to dive headfirst into the issue of the existence of Libertalia, because it's at the heart of any debate about Libertalia. Marcus Rediker will meet us later, and I think he's keeping his comments for 5 p.m. because there's certainly a lot to be discussed with regards to his own interpretation from the 80s. It's not been long that historians have taken pirates and piracy seriously. Is a pirate left-wing or right-wing? David Schumer asked this quite often. Now, about the return of the pirate within history, it's an interesting question. As a reader of your book, I find that there are some things that are much clearer now, such as this connection between what you call the colonial library and the pirate of folklore, whose role in the colonial history was rewritten by the proponents of harsh colonization. I think that's a key contribution in your book. I didn't really understand Michel Lebris because what the proletarian left was doing at the museum, Maritime Museum in the 90s. The pirates turned into a fun, friendly character. He was in a military institution, so it was really quite a surprising mixture. So you have the colonial library, the maritime library, and then there's a colonial myth which you repeat throughout your narrative. Now, I don't know whether Maurizio has something to say with regards to Alexandre's presentation. We can see that we all have very divergent interpretations, even though what we do agree is that the existence of Libertalia is not the key problem. Is it irrelevant or is it relevant? That was one of the entry points in the discussion. When I was doing a critique of Graeber's book, or critiquing the historical aspects, I can see that this is something that Alexandre really emphasized very well in his presentation. I do share Alexandre's idea according to which the myth of Libertalia, the experiences, the historical sources that underpin it, remain within the European Western imagination. And so the attempt to use Betsimisaraka to decolonize this myth is, in my opinion, a failure. As I was saying, I don't think that the Betsimisaraka can be deemed a proto-democracy or proto-republic. I don't think that's the case for pirates either. I'm not an expert on pirate culture. Some experts might have more to add. Marcus Rediker will talk to us about piracy. But I don't think that pirates are indeed a model for proto-democracy or proto-anarchism, really. This is something I suggested indirectly through my critique of Graeber's book, and I do share Alexander's line of thinking. It's a good book. It's quite a good complement to Graeber's book. And it's wonderful that there was such a coincidence in the time of publication, because I think that they're really quite complementary. And I think both of them are really worth reading. That's my opinion on the topic. Yes, that's why I was asking Alexandre about his own publishing project, because together with Maurizio, we found out about your book at the time when we were going to talk about your book in a seminar called Maritime Radicalism. The pirate remains a founding figure of contemporary struggles. One example is the way of speaking of Somali pirates, their manner of speech. Piracy off the coast of Somalia is due to the discredit in which the local populations live. They've been starved by industrial fishing. So there's something circulating throughout the ages. In the Indian Ocean, and David Graeber will talk about the pirates of the Caribbean, but the two oceans are connected. So the publication of your book happened just at the time when we were replaying the scene of the discussion around Graeber. So as Maurizio said, it might be by chance, but it's quite fortunate because it raises a number of issues.
And so we can go over the historiography. You can compare the trends, say, in the US and France, respectively. We were talking about Michel Lebris earlier, but some colleagues have found it very difficult to look at pirates as subjects or objects of history in the name of some kind of intellectual and literary terrorism that I can see David Chonu who wants to take the floor. So, of course, the other panelists, if you feel like speaking, you can, of course. And I have a watchful eye on YouTube. I know that there are a certain number of people looking at on YouTube. And David, you wanted to step in? Yes. Well, very quickly. Thank you very much to both of you for your presentations today. It's more a remark that would perhaps enable us to bridge the gap between your two approaches. It seems to me that the idea that the pirate republics, whether or not they existed, it's not really the issue. I think we all agree on that. What's more interesting, I think, is to look at the history of representations through the book Libertalia, which you do very well, Alexandre, and it seems useful to try to set this book within a wider panorama of colonial endeavours in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, I haven't unfortunately had time to read your book, but there's something that springs to my mind in relation to Libertalia. It's linked to Defoe's analysis of the political forms adopted by pirates. Now, this seems to be a shared imagination between intellectual elites in the European sphere in the 17th and 18th centuries. So they have these projections on the subaltern categories of society. So you have mariners, you have buccaneers, filibusters in different parts of the world, and all of these different representations all focus on subalterns. It's something you find again and again in the history of colonial enterprise, in travel histories. And I think it refers to these, in a sense, an incapacity to self-organize politically. And so the political ideological project that this points to in Libertalia, it's effectively the fear of European elites to see some categories of subaltern populations in Europe shake off their shackles and contest their masters. I mean, this is the issue of representation. Of course, we're not talking about a historical reality in any way, shape or form. But I think, in a sense, we need to think about bridging the gap between what Maurizio was saying and Alexandre told us, because this is really a fertile ground for thinking about the very notion of the state, the fear of elites, that subaltern populations will rise up and challenge them, leading them to establish the trappings of the state to be able to exercise control and domination over society. Anyone? Does anyone want to step in? Alexandre. Yes, thank you. It's true that on that type of, on that scale, if you look at it that way, you can look at things like that. In terms of Libertalia, it seemed to me rather that Libertalia could be considered one of the Protestant utopias, of which there are a whole spate in the Indian Ocean, or at least a spate of works looking at these utopian societies, utopian experiments. This is the case with François Léguer, who left and went to travel to Bourbon, which was the island of Eden, today's La Réunion, that may have been a safe haven for Huguenots. And it was then rewritten by François-Maximilien Misson. And for me, Libertalia belongs in that line of Protestant utopias. And then looking at the pirates themselves, the vision that you can have of them, there's all the imagined aspects, if you like. The Madagascar throughout the 17th century remained impossible. It remained staunchly against Europeans. Any attempts to colonize the islands by Europeans and by French Europeans, more specifically, completely failed. And so the fact that pirates managed to settle on an island, which is a huge island, even at the time, when it was shown on maps, it was portrayed almost as big as the current United Kingdom, because it really was huge. And so that, again, gives a sense of how imaginary projections were given shape in those centuries. And so the fact that pirates did settle in Madagascar, and the fact that they're seen as the kings of Madagascar, like Every and others actually, this points to a fantasy realm around these pirate groups that were seen as being hugely powerful, immensely wealthy. Now, this is perhaps nothing special, but there are many groups that tried to create alliances. There are loads of rumors being bandied about in France, and there are archival evidence in the documents that we have, which are very anecdotal in nature. The curé, the priest in Rochefort, sends a letter, for example, to the French king to ask that he give the pirates of Madagascar amnesty. And it may seem a very improbable link-up, but it just gives you a sense of the kind of place that Madagascar and pirates had in the imagination of people, in their projections and representations. And then in terms of the fear that these pirates would self-organize, again, I didn't really see things like that. For me, and especially for those French who had settled on Bourbon, on the island of Reunion, I think they were rather seen as pioneers of colonization, and so that's why they were given amnesty, because they had to integrate, they had to set up their networks. They were there, they knew the terrain, they were more or less acclimatized, they'd sometimes married or mixed with the local population. So that's how I had seen their role. That was my perception, but who knows? Perhaps, Maurizio, what you were saying is in some way correct. Did I see a hand somewhere? Raphael, he's disappeared. Well, Maurizio, yeah. Just what David was saying. What I found really interesting in Graeber's work is specifically when he talks about Defoe, and he talks about his reaction to the story about Avery, who'd set up a kingdom in Madagascar. And he publishes in 1707 a plea for Avery and for the kingdom that Avery supposedly founded, for it to be recognized by the English crown. And the arguments that Defoe puts forward are the following. He says that many states have as their foundations or founding fathers bandits or those outside the remit of the law. So the imperial crown would have had to recognize them. It was in their interest to do so. That's why I kind of see pirates as proto-republicans, or because years later, that's exactly what the British Crown did. They recognized the colonizers. Avery, at the time, was just a notorious criminal. He was an international criminal. And I think that what's interesting in the history of banditry or groupings outside the state, and I'm Italian, so it makes me think of the criminalization of all the bandit groups in the South that gave rise to the instatement of a veritable mafia in the South. And so if the legal framework had been different, if rather than pointing the finger at these groups and criminalizing them, these were liminal groupings, these were groups that didn't have a very set place within state structures, perhaps the story would have deployed itself very differently, not just for bandits and banditry, but for pirates and piracy and organized crime and the mafia in Italy. Who knows? That seems to be somehow a giant leap, but I hope that it rings a bell or it sparks something, and I can see that Raphael has raised his hand, so I'll give him the floor. And then there are a couple of questions that we've been asked via the chat. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I was just thinking whilst I was listening to the various speakers that perhaps
ces personnes n'étaient pas nées pirates, ils étaient des marins.
you know, these pirates, bear in mind, they're not pirates, they're not born pirates, they're mariners, seafarers, and they become pirates. And in a sense, when they got to Madagascar, they were settlers. I mean, for the local Malagasy population, there wasn't necessarily a big difference between merchants or slave traders or a pirate that would come and set up shop that wanted to do business just like any self-respecting slave trader. So perhaps it was the same thing for them, that perhaps they, in a sense, became more focused on merchant activities rather than their piracy, at least during their time in Madagascar, especially for those that took part in the slave trade and sometimes quite actively in the northeastern parts of Madagascar. And there are many French people, either interpreters, deserters, soldiers, who also settled along the coastlines of Madagascar in precisely the same types of conditions and circumstances as the pirates. They would settle, they would marry a Malagasy woman, they would gain status and power, and then they would just live out the rest of their life there. And so, are we just talking about pirates here, or are we rather talking perhaps about a haphazard collection of hodgepodge people, merchants, seafarers, deserters, soldiers, who end up there under no European authority? Because you have to think about the fact that Madagascar was not submitted to any external colonial rule, European, very far from it, actually. The French only got there in 1750 or so, wasn't it rather just an opportunistic chance to set up their own little personal kingdoms? Like King Samuel, did the Malagasy not see them as such? As merchants who, rather than moving on, wished to settle, wished to play a role in society, and the Malagasy could draw profit from this, from their military knowledge, for example. So it's not necessarily pirates who had, profited from the island. It could also be the Malagazys who drew profit from the presence of these European settlers. And not just the settlers themselves, but also the fact that they had ships, because they could then sell slaves and garner more wealth. At the middle of the 18th century in Fool's Point, in Fool Point, people used to say, as long as there is a ship in the port of Fool Point, the Malagazys submit to Europeans. But as soon as the vessel leaves port, the Europeans are no longer protected by that aura and are open to Malagasy retaliation. Thank you. Yep, I fully agree. We have a tendency to reduce the diversity of all the kinds of people that were on the coastlines of Madagascar and just call them pirates. I mean, in a sense that the actual pirate colonies in Madagascar were quite few and far between. Yes, there were seafarers, there were merchants, there were military men. There was quite a crowd of people, and very diverse at that. And we have a tendency to try to subsume them under the generic banner category of pirates. However, I'm not that sure that the Malagasy didn't actually draw a distinction between these different categories of people. You had the Malagasy rulers who particularly hated the French, for example. And then there's another archive where they talk about the fact that they'd only massacred French citizens, the English was sort of separated out. And this is linked to the colonial endeavours undertaken by the French crown at Fort Dauphin and the very violent battle that ensued. And so the rulers along the coastlines, the Malagasy societies of the coastline, I think they were well able to make a distinction between who was doing what and who was who, and thereby being able to define who was a pirate. But we don't really have any archival evidence. We don't have documents that relates the views of the Malagazys, of the pirates. So it's quite hard to try to glean, but we can think that they were able to draw a difference, though. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions that have come through on the chat. One is for Maurizio and one rather for Alexandre. Maurizio. Auréa Galdo asks what tie-in you can draw between your reading of Graeber and your own field work. Is there a past link? Is there something that could be explored in the future? Is this something that could lead to more field work, or did reading Graeber echo things that you may have gathered in situ? Nathan Godet has a question perhaps more for Alexander. Nathan's writing a thesis with the hydrographic services of the Marine on the history of maps, and he asks whether the links between colonialism and the pirate figure also exist elsewhere. He's thinking about the Tonkin region, where the French have to face Chinese pirates. So a multi-situational approach to the figure of piracy and to the link up with colonial history. Just a couple of questions I'm throwing in there. Perhaps we could start with Maurizio and then Alexandre, and then David wanted to say something. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. I would say that both are true. There's a tie-in with my past fieldwork and the tie-in with my potential future fieldwork, because as I was saying earlier, this question of pirates in Madagascar is also something which helps you look at the way that power structures emerged in Madagascar. And Graeber says this himself when he refers back to the thesis that he'd put forward with Salins in the previous work. The pirates were welcomed as foreigners and often as foreign kings. So, in a sense, this kind of figure of the foreign king, who was also responsible for founding the first kingdoms in Madagascar. This is also something that could be found with the Betsimisaraka and the pirates, the pirate descendants who founded that community, probably English pirates and a Malagasy princess.
So the connection with the royalty that I'm studying on the East Coast are obvious. And as we often discussed with Vincent and with the museum, the idea of following Graeber's leads and to go and question people on the East Coast, because the descendants of pirates have left traces in oral narratives to try to see, on the one hand, the Western myth of Libertalia, and then the local vision, which we are gradually getting today, beyond the myths and representations that you can see in large towns and those sorts of representations. So I think there could be work in the field done on the East Coast on this matter. Thank you, Alexandre, on the issue of piracy and colonies. In the second half of the 18th century, a connection was made between pirates and colonizers. The pirates were seen as pioneers of colonialization. Then what was said about Tonkin in Indochina and the figure of pirates and Chinese pirates? It's not really the case. because those were not European pirates. So there's no connection between the colonizers and those pirates, because it was the Westerners who were the colonizers. There's a number of work that's been done on the way in which the pirates in Tonkin were represented. But to get back to Madagascar, and this is the basis for the myth of Libertalia, and for the use of the figure of the pirate and the character of the pirate, is the fact that he's supposed to be European, French sometimes, hence its widespread dissemination in France during the colonial era. In the story of Libertalia, the pirate is French. So there is a connection between pirates and colonization, if the pirates are European in these particular spaces. Maurizio will talk about Sandokan, perhaps. David, did you have a question? Then there will be other speakers. It's more of a comment than a question, just to react to what Raphael has said. I think we have an issue to do with methodology, to do with the Caribbean as well as Madagascar in the second half of the 18th century. How do we qualify these Western communities living on the coast of Madagascar? If we qualify them as pirate communities, well, there's nothing obvious about doing that, because piracy is not an activity, it's a legal label. Pirate may be a name you attach to those communities, but it's not necessarily relevant to designate a social space, because those sailors did not label themselves as pirates. Being called a pirate is something that can lead you to the tribunals and to be hung. So if we carry on talking about pirates, it's a real methodological issue. Of course, we are always circumscribed by language, but this is why in my presentation I try to limit piracy to the legal sphere and to try to talk about maritime predation, to talk about the economic activity. Of course, words tend to be limiting. Now, before answering, I'd like to share two questions with you. Perhaps you can give me an overall answer. There's a question about the link between pirates and Madagascan women. This is one of the more powerful theories that David Graeber puts forward. Perhaps we can keep that question aside for later, but it is central for Graeber. And so we would have liked to know a little bit more about that. Then somebody says, isn't the history of Libertalia synonymous with change and freedom for the Madagascan people? So these are two questions which have been put to me. We come to the end of this first session. I don't know if we can answer such major questions quickly, but so perhaps we can keep them for the second half of the presentation. Maurizio, Alexandre, perhaps you can say a few words by way of conclusion. Now, just to answer David, what you're saying is true. What's surprising is that in the narrative itself of Libertalia, Misson does not want to be labeled a pirate. He says we are not pirates, we are defenders of rights, and he refuses to be called a pirate throughout the story. This doesn't tend to be mentioned often, but it does feature in the text from the outset. As for the question about women, perhaps we can discuss this at the end. Now, about change and freedom in Madagascar. and about what Libertalia did for Madagascar. Well, I tend to say the exact reverse, because Libertalia excluded Madagascans from its history. From 1728 to this day, it is a fantasized representation of Madagascar. So Libertalia cannot be an object that enables us to understand the history of Madagascar. However, deconstructing the myth is a way of seeking out the history of Madagascar and reinserting Madagascans within their own history. Perhaps this is something we can talk about later. This is the twofold structure of your reasoning. Libertalia is entirely European, but it cannot be understood without Madagascar. Maurizio, perhaps you can say a few words just to end this session. Yes, the question about women. One of Graeber's innovations was to reassert the importance of the place of women within the story of the foundation of the Betsimisaraka Confederation. Women played the role as a go-between. Women were intermediaries, and when ships sailed away, as Raphael was saying, foreigners had to find a way to communicate with local populations, and women were one of the more powerful ways to communicate and intermediate with the local populations, not just for pirates, but for Madagascan kings as well. Kings are often presented with foreigners according to Salin's model of the foreign king. Well, this king has to be able to forge an alliance with the local communities. Often this alliance is done through marriage with local women. Continuity between European pirates and the foreign kings who founded the kingdoms of Madagascar and probably came from Indonesia.
C'est ce rôle central, je pense qu'on en reparlera.
So this has played a central role. I'm sure we'll talk about it again, but it's really important, the central role of women. Thank you very much to all of you. We are going to end this first session, and we'll keep a little bit of energy in store for the second round, to use a sporty metaphor. There will be a lot to talk about after Marcus Rediker's conclusions and after David and Raphael's presentation. David and Raphael have already taken part in this first part. We're going to have a 10-minute break, and we shall meet again during the second session, which will be animated by Matteo Gallo on the channel, which you can see on the museum channel. And so we will have questions via the chat of the YouTube thread. I'd like to thank Alexandre, Maurizio, and all of the participants. Anna will join us during the second half. So I look forward to seeing you again for the second half of this debate about the pirates and Madagascar and anthropology.